Sports Talk Chicago. Here with Jon Zaghloul, and we are back and ready for today's special guest. He's a UChicago professor of 38 years, a noted sports economist, and a Chicago Life columnist. Please welcome Professor Allen Sanderson to the program. Professor, it's great to have you on again. How are you?
I'm just fine. Thanks very much, John.
So, Professor, what's wrong with March Madness and the college athletic scene?
Oh, I suppose something that's now over 100 years old in a way is the continued, basically monopoly and monopsony power of the NCAA. It's just they have such control over all aspects of the game, and it's something we wouldn't permit in any other part of the economy. But they've sort of been able to fly for 100 years below the radar. However, that may come to an end fairly soon in the next 2 or 3 months. On Wednesday of this week, Thursday was opening day for Major League Baseball, but Wednesday was opening day for the Supreme Court in terms of hearing a very famous case that's going before the court to attack those elements, especially in the labor market. I was one of a small number of economists, nationally, sports economists, who wrote a friend of the court brief on the part of the plaintiffs. So I have particular interest in this case.
What was said in that brief, or what did you touch on when you wrote it?
Well, just basically that we're arguing that the NCAA is basically price fixing, or in this case, wage fixing. In that as an umbrella organization, they set the maximum amount, which is approximately zero, that college athletes can be paid. And it really only affects two sports. Really, football and men's basketball are the two that are the primary points of emphasis. But that we argue is against antitrust laws for price fixing.
How do you think this whole thing will be resolved in June?
Well, I don't know if I took Wednesday's testimony, the 2-hour testimony by the attorneys on both sides, and extrapolated that, I would say the NCAA is pretty much in trouble. Probably 7, if not 8, of the Supreme Court justices were fairly skeptical of the NCAA's argument as to why they had to create or maintain this amateur athletics as they define it.
What's your response to those who say athletes get a free education, that's their paycheck?
Well, in economics, as you know from my courses, there's no such thing as free. But in part, they don't get a free education. They don't get the same education that you get at the University of Chicago or even a student at the University of Alabama gets. In that, from probably 6 o'clock in the morning until 10 o'clock at night, the college football player or men's basketball player, and not only just in season but well beyond the season, is basically owned by the coach, who tells him when to wake up and when to eat and when to do this and when to do that, and what majors they cannot pursue, what courses they cannot pursue because they conflict with practice or other kind of educational activities. So you don't get nominally they're supposed to work 20 hours a week, and that's just one of the biggest jokes there is. It's basically a full-time job. And let me also add, too, that it may well be that the quarterback at Clemson or the running back at Alabama gets full tuition fees, room and board, and a little walking around money. But the stars on those teams are worth millions of dollars in terms of television and the fannies in the seats. So I think of them as the most exploited workers in the U.S. economy.
How could that be fixed?
Well, it's not obvious what would happen. There are several avenues can go. One would be And in this regard, the NFL and NBA are certainly complicit in that they have rules. Again, when you turned 18, suppose you had a lot of athletic talent and a smart guy. If you wanted to, at 18, you could play Major League Baseball. You could be on the professional golf tour, actually play in Augusta this weekend in the Masters, assuming you're good enough. You can join the professional rodeo. You can drive an Indy car. Those are all legal. You can work for Macy's. You can join the Army. They're just two occupations you can't do. You're not allowed to play professional basketball. You're not allowed to play professional football. And that's just an anomaly, and also one that where, again, the NBA and NFL are just in collusion with the NCAA in this regard. The two professional leagues get their training provided for them for free, and get a couple more years of maturity behind the kid before they're drafted or before he enters the professional leagues. One thing could be that, in fact, like Major League Baseball has minor leagues, it would force the professional basketball and football leagues to actually have their own development programs and sort of minor league teams. That's one outcome. Another, and I think it would pass antitrust muster easily, is that if the NCAA ceased to exist and just went poof, the decision-making units wouldn't be the NCAA, but it could be the conferences. So the Pac-12, the Big Ten, the SEC, the ACC. If you had a half dozen conferences dictating what they wanted to do, that would pass muster, just as we wouldn't like one airline in the United States. But, we have 4 domestic airline carriers saying that may be enough to provide some level of competition. So I think you could have that. The Pac-12 could say, look, we'll just play within our conference. We won't play outside the conference. And we're freed at that point to set our own rules for how the Pac-12 would operate, and the Big 12 or the Big 10, how they would operate. And so that's another way that it could turn out. And an extension of that is, universities pay their professors. They pay the people who mow the lawns. There's no reason why they can't pay the athletes.
Is there an ethical problem with paying athletes to you?
No, I don't. I don't see that. If I go back 100 years, if I go back 50 years, there wasn't all that much money in college athletics. It was a sort of a small business, as it were. Nobody made a whole lot of money. The same was true of baseball players or football players or others before free agency, before unionization. They didn't make a whole lot of money either. They made a nice salary, but not outrageous. If I give you an example, given the NCAA men's final game is tonight, in 1984, in inflation-adjusted dollars, CBS paid the NCAA $15 million, 15 million with an M, to broadcast March Madness. This year, I don't have this year's numbers because it's not yet, and there wasn't a 2020 tournament because of COVID. But in 2019, the last tournament played, CBS and its affiliates paid the NCAA $1.1 billion with a B. Okay, that's a hell of a lot of money. Okay, and you get football coaches, basketball coaches walking around making 7-figure, in some cases 8-figure incomes. If I take the 50 states in the United States, in 45 of those 50 states, the highest paid public official in the state is not the governor by a long shot. It's the football coach or the basketball coach. I mean, the head football coach at the University of Illinois is by far the highest paid public official of the state of Illinois. Coaches make a ton of money, and in part because there are two things. One is you're not paying the players, so you move to the next avenue. The second is television. It's just that's what happened between 1984 and today is television. So, I mean, to the extent you ask, I think this is an ethical issue. I do think it's an ethical issue, not in the way you meant it, but in the way of, it's an ethical issue because these kids are being exploited so much. Okay? Let me also add, too, and it's another element in here. If you take a look at the game tonight, or if you took the 64 teams or the 68 teams in the tournament, in the men's tournament, and walk through them, of the 10 starters in tonight's game, I think 7 of them will be black, and that's about the percentage across the board in Division I basketball, men's basketball. So basically, you've got the people who are the most exploited workers, and they are workers out there on the court. They may be having fun, but they're working and generating millions of dollars. They're basically black. And I think we ought to be ashamed of ourselves for doing that.
Professor Allen Sanderson here on Sports Talk Chicago. Professor, let me ask you this. Do you see college athletics not existing at one point in the future?
I think it's possible. Well, existing in the form that it exists now, I think it could exist, let's call it Division III, University of Chicago level, in that it could be just another sort of thing that you do. You join a fraternity or sorority, or you participate in this kind of club sport or model UN or whatever the activity may be, but not at this gigantic level that we've gotten to. I think that's entirely possible, and I don't think necessarily bad. We've got professional leagues here, so it could flop down to sort of a D3 level. That's entirely possible, and in part because the other is there are massive amounts of revenue, as I've said, that go into, and it's basically two sports, football and men's basketball, that go into that. But in addition to the revenues that come in, there are expenditures that go out. Again, paying a coach $10 million and so forth. Or building basically what's a swimming pool with the University of Alabama as part of their training center for the football team. It's just this kind of just asinine expenditures, and the reason colleges do it is they're not paying the players, and so you have to spend money in other ways to show you what great facilities you have, or having the world's best coach or something like that. That's the way you recruit the athletes. If they were paid, I mean, the University of Alabama has far better facilities for its football team than the Chicago Bears do, in part because the Chicago Bears pay the players, and the players would just as soon have the paycheck as opposed to a swimming pool. And they use the paycheck for the recruiting device. The other is because of this, one often talks about the revenue that comes in, but one also should talk about the expenditures that go out within the athletic department. And by that, I mean that except for probably, I would say, around 15 Division I football teams out of the 150, 160 teams that exist now, only about 15, maybe 20 actually make money. The rest of them all lose money. And one of the things, in response to your question of could I see college football or basketball going away, at some point, a university president or the board of trustees might decide, look, we've got to pay these guys now. We can't afford that. We're already losing money. We're going to lose more money. We just can't afford to do that. And so it may well be that you'd move from 150 Division I football teams down to maybe 50, 60, something like that, the power conferences. And the rest would just go away because universities would make a decision, this is costing us too much money. We can't afford to do this any longer.
How do you feel about that, to see lesser programs but more players be paid?
I think it's a trade-off I'm willing to support. And again, we have around 30 pro teams in basketball and football. There's no reason if we had 50, say, call it Division I, high-powered, and players are being paid in college athletics. That's sufficient number. Okay. Another element that's happening, as also going to be and in this Supreme Court case, is some legislation that was passed in California a year or two ago. It sort of gets called pay for play legislation, which has now been passed in several states. The sort of shorthand for it becomes what's called NIL, N-I-L, name, image, likeness. When I play on a Division I basketball team or Division I football team for the NCAA, I sign a contract that basically says the NCAA owns me for the rest of my life. Okay, that they own my name, they own my likeness, they own my image. I can't make any money off that. I can't sell my image. But the legislation that's in those states and is going to just sort of keep adding until it gets to close to 50 probably, is that the athlete owns his image, or in the case of some non-revenue sports, her image, and that the athletes can prosper by basically trademarking that image. That's one of the sort of the doors opening. And that's already law. It takes effect a year from now.
So we could see athletes, in theory, be able to have endorsements in college. That's going to happen.
Yeah, it's already, that legislation it's not going away. California was the first state, but as I say, they're now something 7 or 8. It's on its way. The number is just going steadily up.
Professor Allen Sanderson here on Sports Talk Chicago. Professor, what's your take on the NFL's extra game beginning in 2021?
Well, it's sort of an extra game with an asterisk in that the total number of games doesn't change because they add one regular season game and they drop one of the preseason games. So instead of 4 plus 16, it's 3 plus 17, which is about the same sum. The preseason games are fairly worthless, but again, it's been a way in which the NFL can force season ticket holders, which is basically everybody, to pay for something they really value at far less than the ticket price. I suspect it's okay in that it was negotiated between the ownership and the player side. So, some are more in favor of it as the others than the other side of the table. But it was a negotiated contract, so I'm okay with that. Let me add another element of this, coming back to the NCAA issue. Again, could have had possibly, barring the way the game ended the other night, a fabulous game between Gonzaga and UCLA. If I go back to the heyday of UCLA back in the 60s, when they were the dominant team and the legendary coach John Wooden, the team when UCLA was playing the last game for the championship, their total season was about 25 games. Tonight, I assume, and again, it's a little tricky because of COVID and some games got canceled, including an earlier Gonzaga Baylor game. But in a regular season, say in 2019, or even tonight, if I throw in the COVID games that got canceled, the two teams on the court are probably playing somewhere around their 40th game. The season has expanded enormously. Why? Because you're not paying the players. Okay, Okay, you can keep playing games. Why we don't have to play these guys? We don't have to pay these guys. Or traditionally, if I go back 50 years, the football schedule was 10 games, a 10-game season for the powerhouses, and then they go to a bowl game, so maybe they play 11 games. I assume this last year, who won the national championship was probably playing their 14th, possibly 15th game. And there's been a tremendous increase in the length of scheduling. Why? You're not paying the players. Would the NFL like to go to a 25-game schedule? No. Why? Because they'd have to split that money with the players. And it just, beyond some point, doesn't make sense. They don't net enough to expand the schedule. So it does from 16 to 17. Would it go to 20? Probably not, because they couldn't make enough money off it to justify it, given the half they have to give to the players. But when you're not paying the players, sure, let's keep playing. Yeah.
In the NFL's case, and we've talked about this a bit before in class, the idea that players aren't safe anymore. They're leading with their heads because helmets have become more protective versus the 1950s when they were leather and there was nothing to protect them. Do you feel like this is a bit hypocritical by the NFL, that they advocate for player safety, but then they turn around and add an extra game?
Yeah, well, again, I'll grant you it's an extra regular season game, but it's not. They're still playing 20 games, not more than that. It's some of it you just can't do much about, or the unintended consequences. Also, again, if I go back 50 years and say what was the average weight of an NFL player versus today, I'm making this up, but I'm guessing that the average player today weighs 30 or 40 more pounds. And the laws of physics still apply in terms of force equals mass times acceleration. And that mass has just increased tremendously. So they're running at each other harder. Also, you give them safer helmets, helmets that provide more safety, they're just going to run at each other even harder. If you wanted no injuries or very small number of injuries, you just have guys out there wearing cleats and be nude. You would see far fewer injuries at that point. Okay? Again, these unintended consequences, sometimes you can't do anything about it. It turns out, if you look at the COVID period, the last year, and take a look at automobile deaths, you would think that they would have gone down. There are just fewer people driving. They're not driving to work. They're working from home. The malls are closed. The restaurants are closed. And Americans drove far fewer miles last year than they did the year before. But automobile death increased. Why? There are fewer cars on the road. They're going faster because there's less congestion. And so the increase in automobile safety has just gone down. Drivers are driving faster. They're driving less with their seatbelts on. They feel safer because there are just far fewer cars out here on the road. And they're driving when they're drunk, or they're driving when they're texting more than they did before. And so what you would think, oh, there are going to be fewer automobile deaths than there were the year before. No, there are more. And so the same thing with injuries. You'd think, gee, we've got safer helmets. These guys will, get fewer injuries. No, they're going to get more because they're just going to run at each other harder.